Somewhere in Russia, in the summer of 1918, 11 people walked down a flight of stairs into a basement. None of them walked back up. And for the better part of a century, the world wasn't entirely sure what had happened to them down there. Not because the killing was subtle, not because the evidence was ambiguous, but because the people who did it spent decades making sure nobody could prove anything at all. The family was the Romanovs, the last imperial dynasty of Russia. A Tsar, his wife, their 5 children, and 4 loyal members of their household, executed in secret, buried in secret, and then denied, deflected, and lied about for so long that the truth became one of the most stubbornly contested mysteries of the 20th century. But here's the part that makes this story genuinely strange, even after accounting for all the political noise and deliberate deception. When investigators finally found the burial site decades later, they didn't find 11 sets of remains. They found 9. 2 bodies were missing, and not just missing in the way that bones scatter over time or records go incomplete. Missing in a way that suggested someone, at some point, had made a very deliberate decision about what to do with them separately. That detail, 2 absent bodies, kept the mystery alive long after most people assumed the case was closed. It fed rumours, fueled imposters, and gave governments on both sides of the Cold War reasons to stay quiet when clarity might have been more useful. It kept families in legal and emotional limbo, and it kept historians, forensic scientists, and amateur investigators circling the same set of questions for generations. Who exactly was in that basement? What happened in the hours and days after? Where did the remains go, and why did it take until 2007, 89 years after the fact, to find the last of them? Those are the questions this video is going to work through, and I want to be upfront that some of them have cleaner answers than others. The science eventually got very good. The DNA evidence is genuinely compelling. But the historical record around what happened that night and what happened in the weeks after is still tangled in layers of Soviet-era suppression, competing eyewitness testimony, and documents that went missing for reasons that were never entirely explained. What I find remarkable about this story is not just the crime itself, which is horrifying enough on its own terms. It's the machinery that kept the truth buried. The secrecy wasn't accidental, it was engineered. A new government trying to consolidate power doesn't advertise the fact that it shot a teenage boy and 4 young women in a basement. So instead it built silence around the whole thing, and that silence hardened over decades into something almost impossible to break through. And yet people kept trying. Investigators who risked their careers, scientists who worked without official support, survivors who may or may not have been who they claimed to be, a local geologist who quietly mapped a patch of disturbed earth in the Ural forest, and told almost no one for years. The story of how this mystery finally came apart is almost as strange as the mystery itself. Before we get into any of that, I want to do what I always do. If you're listening to this right now, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely check these. There's something about knowing someone in Tokyo and someone in Toronto are hearing the same story at completely different hours of their day that I find hard to explain but impossible to stop thinking about, so tell me. And then let's go back to Russia, to a country coming apart at the seams, and to a family that had no idea what was coming. To understand why 11 people ended up in a basement in the Ural Mountains, you have to understand what Russia had become by 1917. Not the Russia of grand palaces and imperial ceremony, though that world was real enough. The Russia of breadlines and frozen corpses and mothers who hadn't seen their sons in 3 years because those sons were dying in trenches for a war that made less and less sense the longer it went on. Russia in the years before the revolution wasn't a country on the edge. It was a country that had already gone over the edge and was in freefall, just hadn't hit the ground yet. The war is where you have to start. When Nicholas II committed Russia to the First World War in 1914, he was making a decision that the country's infrastructure, its military supply chains, its entire economic structure simply could not support. Within a year, Russian soldiers were being sent to the front without rifles. Without rifles. The plan was to pick them up from the men who got shot first. Food shortages were catastrophic. The railways, which were supposed to move supplies to the front and grain to the cities, were overwhelmed and breaking down simultaneously. By 1916, Petrograd was running out of bread while grain rotted in storage elsewhere in the country, because nobody could organize the logistics to move it. People were hungry in ways that make political loyalty an abstraction. When you're watching your children go without food, the divine right of Tsars stops being a very compelling argument, and Nicholas himself made the situation worse in ways that seem almost impossible to fully explain. He was not a stupid man. He was not cruel in any simple sense, but he had an extraordinary talent for making exactly the wrong decision at exactly the wrong moment. In 1915, he took personal command of the Russian military, which meant that every subsequent defeat on the front, and there were many, became personally his failure. His wife Alexandra, deeply devoted but politically disastrous, had fallen under the influence of Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic who claimed he could treat the haemophilia of their son Alexei. The degree to which Rasputin actually shaped government policy is still debated, but the perception that an eccentric peasant faith healer was whispering in the Empress's ear while the Tsar was at the front was politically toxic in a way that's hard to overstate. It gave the mounting public fury a face, a story, a symbol of everything that seemed wrong and corrupt and broken. The loss of public confidence didn't happen overnight. It accumulated. Every botched battle, every food shortage, every political appointment that seemed to reward loyalty over competence, every crackdown on protests that killed people who had only wanted bread. By February of 1917, the situation had reached the point where a series of strikes and protests in Petrograd simply couldn't be contained. When Nicholas ordered troops to suppress the demonstrations, something happened that nobody in the imperial government had believed was possible. Significant numbers of soldiers refused. Some of them joined the protesters. The machinery of repression, the thing that had kept the regime in place through previous moments of crisis, was no longer reliable. Nicholas abdicated on March 15th, 1917. He did it believing, or perhaps hoping, that his brother Michael would take the throne and that the dynasty would survive in some modified constitutional form. Michael declined within 24 hours. Just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule were over. But here's where the story becomes something other than a straightforward political transition. The question of what to do with the former Tsar and his family immediately became a problem that nobody had a clean answer to. The provisional government that took power after the abdication placed the family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. It wasn't vindictive so much as practical. Nicholas was still a symbol. Monarchists existed. The possibility that some faction might try to restore him, or use him as a figurehead, was real enough to take seriously. And that fear, the fear of royalist rescue, was not entirely paranoid. European monarchies were still in place across the continent. Nicholas was a cousin of both the German Kaiser and the British King. There were genuine diplomatic conversations, most of them going nowhere, about whether Britain might offer the family asylum. When those conversations collapsed for reasons that still generate historical controversy, the Romanovs lost what might have been their only realistic path to safety. Meanwhile, Russia kept fracturing. The Bolsheviks seized power in October of 1917. The civil war that followed was vicious and sprawling, with multiple competing factions fighting across an enormous country. In that context, the Romanovs stopped being merely an inconvenience and started being perceived as a potential rallying point for counter-revolutionary forces. Every month the family remained alive, the new regime calculated the political risk of their existence, and as Bolshevik control over territory became contested, as White Army forces pushed closer to the regions where the family was being held, that calculation kept shifting. The family was moved further east, eventually landing in Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains in the spring of 1918. The people guarding them were no longer the relatively restrained imperial servants of the early months of captivity. They were ideologically committed Bolsheviks operating under orders that were becoming, with each passing week, harder to interpret as anything other than what they actually were. The window had been closing for months. By the time the family arrived in Ekaterinburg, most of them probably didn't know how narrow it had become. But the people planning their fate almost certainly did. The first months of captivity had a strange, suspended quality to them. Life at the Alexander Palace wasn't freedom, but it wasn't exactly a dungeon either. Nicholas gardened. The children studied. Alexandra, whose health had always been fragile, spent long hours in her rooms. There were guards, restrictions on movement, visitors screened and limited, but the rhythms of daily life retained some texture of what had come before. If you didn't look too hard at what surrounded it, you could almost mistake it for a kind of enforced retirement rather than a prelude to anything worse. But the restrictions tightened methodically, almost like something breathing in. Correspondence was monitored and then reduced. The family's access to news became increasingly filtered. Servants who had served the Romanovs for years were gradually replaced or removed. Each individual change was small enough to absorb, but the cumulative effect was a steady narrowing of the world, a reduction of autonomy so incremental that it was possible, perhaps necessary, to tell yourself that things hadn't fundamentally changed, even as they obviously had. Nicholas himself seemed to adapt to captivity with a kind of resigned passivity that had characterized his entire reign. He read, he chopped wood, he played with his children. His diaries from this period are almost disconcertingly calm given what was happening around him. Whether this reflected genuine equanimity, a religious acceptance of suffering, or something closer to a profound failure to grasp the nature of his situation, is a question historians have been turning over ever since. Probably it was some combination of all three. The provisional government under Kerensky had reasons to keep the family secure, but also reasons to keep them visible as political assets, or at least negotiating chips. The British asylum question hovered in the background throughout this period. King George V was Nicholas's first cousin, and the initial signals from London suggested that an invitation might be extended. Then it wasn't. The precise reasons remain genuinely contested. Some historians put the responsibility on the British government, reluctant to welcome a deposed autocrat whose presence might inflame domestic radical sentiment. Others lay more blame on the king himself, nervous about the optics. Whatever the internal reasoning, the door closed. The family stayed, and the world they were staying in kept deteriorating. When the Bolsheviks took power in October of 1917, the calculus governing the family's fate shifted in ways that were not immediately legible but were real. The new regime was not interested in the Romanovs as bargaining chips in the way the provisional government had been. They were interested in them as a problem that had symbolic weight on multiple sides, that required containment, and that would eventually require a permanent solution, though the shape of that solution was not yet fixed. In August of 1917, before the Bolshevik seizure of power, the family had already been moved from Tsarskoye Selo east to Tobolsk in western Siberia. The reasoning was partly about security, partly about putting more physical distance between the Romanovs and whatever political chaos was brewing in the capital. Tobolsk was quiet, remote, not strategically significant. For several months the family lived in the former governor's house there, and the conditions were by some accounts the least oppressive of their captivity. The local population was less aggressively hostile. The guards were somewhat less rigid. There were moments that felt almost livable. But the civil war was changing everything. The contest between the Bolshevik Red Army and the loosely aligned anti-Bolshevik White forces was spreading across enormous territories, and the Urals were becoming a critical zone of contest. The White forces, which included reconstituted military units, Cossack fighters, and assorted nationalist and monarchist factions, were advancing. Ekaterinburg, in the Ural Mountains, was a Bolshevik stronghold, a regional hub of radical ideology, and a city where local Bolshevik power had a particularly hard, uncompromising character. Here's where the question of who actually controlled decisions gets genuinely complicated. The Bolshevik power structure in 1918 was not a clean hierarchy, with instructions flowing neatly from Moscow to the provinces. The Ural Regional Soviet, based in Ekaterinburg, had its own leadership, its own ideological temperature, its own relationships with Moscow that were sometimes cooperative and sometimes characterized by the kind of local autonomy that central authority couldn't fully suppress. When decisions about the Romanovs were being made, the interplay between central Bolshevik leadership and the Ural Soviets was murky, in ways that still generate historical debate. Moscow wanted control over the situation. Ekaterinburg's leadership had strong opinions about what the situation required. The boundary between orders received and decisions taken independently is genuinely difficult to locate. The family was transferred to Ekaterinburg in April and May of 1918. The move itself was conducted in stages, with Nicholas, Alexandra and one of their daughters arriving first, the other children following weeks later after Alexei, who had suffered a serious haemophilia episode, recovered enough to travel. The separation was agonizing, the children travelling with limited staff, uncertain about conditions ahead. What they arrived into was categorically different from anything that had come before. The Ipatiev House, which the Bolsheviks had requisitioned and renamed the House of Special Purpose, was ringed with fencing, its windows painted over so the family couldn't see out and passers-by couldn't see in. The guards were selected for their ideological reliability, not their humanity. The commandants who oversaw the family in Ekaterinburg were operating in an environment where the White Army was closing in from multiple directions, and the political pressure to resolve the Romanov question was intensifying by the week. The move east hadn't been a precaution, it had been a trajectory, and Ekaterinburg, with its radical local politics, its isolation, its geography deep in the Urals, was not a safer place to wait out the civil war. It was the terminus of a journey that had been moving in one direction the entire time, even when it was possible to believe otherwise. By the time the family settled into the Ipatiev House, the window wasn't just narrow anymore. It had been painted over, fenced in, and placed under guard. What happened next had, in a very real sense, been building since the moment Nicholas signed his abdication 14 months before. Inside, the Ipatiev House did its best to look like an ordinary bourgeois home that had been lightly repurposed. There were still carpets, furniture, framed pictures inherited from the previous owner. The Romanovs were given rooms, beds, a routine. They could walk in the small garden at permitted hours. They could read, sew, pray. On paper, it was house arrest. In practice, it was a fortified holding cell whose defences kept evolving. The fence around the property kept getting higher. First simple wooden palings, then additional boards, then barbed wire. The windows were whitewashed not only on the outside but higher up the panes, so that even the sky was reduced to a narrow strip. A double cordon of guards meant that even the people watching the house were watched by other people watching them. The lane outside was blocked. Neighbours were relocated. What had started as special supervision hardened into something close to complete sensory deprivation. Inside that sealed space, the family's world contracted to a few dozen meters. Their days were marked by roll calls, inspections, forbidden corners of the house. Doors that had once simply been doors became boundaries. Stairs and corridors became controlled zones. Every movement required permission. Every request required an intermediary. The intermediaries were the guards and commandants of the Ural Cheka and the local Soviet, and some of their names have become as bound to the story as the Romanovs themselves. Alexander Avdiev, the first commandant, was a provincial Bolshevik whose main qualification seems to have been political reliability and a willingness to be harsh. Under him, discipline was erratic. Some guards fraternized with the imperial children, accepted trinkets, chatted in the yard. Others were openly hostile. Complaints filtered upward. The family was being treated either too leniently or not harshly enough, depending on who was doing the complaining. In July, Yakov Yurovsky arrived and Avdiev was quietly removed. This change in personnel was not neutral. Yurovsky was a more disciplined revolutionary, with closer ties to the Ural Soviet and the Cheka. He was admired by his comrades for being methodical, unflappable, ideologically firm. If you were trying to run a humane internment facility, he might not have been your first choice. If you were preparing for a decisive, irreversible act under extreme political pressure, he suddenly makes more sense. And orbiting around the house, there were other figures whose later testimonies would shape how we understand what happened there. Philip Goloshchayokin, one of the key leaders of the Ural Regional Soviet. Alexander Beloborodov, the chairman of the Ural Soviet's executive committee. Local Cheka officials who controlled the guard detachments. Each had their own chain of communication to Moscow, their own sense of the stakes, their own idea of how the Romanov problem should be solved. One of the strangest things about the Ipatiev House story is how little most participants later claimed to know in the moment. Guards said they were told almost nothing, kept deliberately in the dark. Orders were relayed verbally, last minute, with minimal explanation. Yurovsky said he informed only those who needed to know, at the latest possible time. Ural Soviet leaders said they acted on urgent instructions from Moscow. Moscow later said the regions had been warned not to take drastic action without consultation. It's hard to disentangle honest ignorance from self-protection. The Bolsheviks understood, even in 1918, that what happened to the former Tsar would matter symbolically. So secrecy wasn't just about operational security. It was about making sure as few people as possible could later point to a clearly signed piece of paper. You can see the compartmentalization almost as a design principle. The guards on the perimeter knew there was a high-value prisoner inside, but not what was being decided about him. The inner guards saw the family every day, but weren't necessarily told what was happening in Moscow. The Ural Soviet discussed the Romanov question in closed sessions, while correspondence with Lenin's government passed through coded telegrams and couriers. Each level saw only a slice. That fragmentation is exactly what makes the next big question so hard to answer. Was what happened in that house essentially a local initiative or a centrally authorized act? One interpretation, supported by some Soviet-era documents and later memoirs, sees the Ural leadership as the prime movers. In this view, Goloshtchokin, Beloborodov, and their circle were convinced the advancing white forces would capture Ekaterinburg. The Romanovs, if freed, could become a rallying point for monarchists and foreign interventionists. The local Bolsheviks believed that eliminating the family was a revolutionary necessity, and they pushed ahead, notifying Moscow only when they were ready to act, or, in some versions, only after the fact. Another reading emphasizes signals from the center. Lenin and Yakov Sverdlov, head of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, were not sentimental men. They understood the symbolic power of the monarchy and the risks it posed if left alive. Some historians argue that while you may never find a clean, unambiguous shoot-them-all order with Lenin's signature, there are enough hints, telegrams that speak of no possibility of evacuation, reports about final measures, retrospective statements from Bolshevik insiders, to suggest that Moscow at least gave tacit approval. In this interpretation, the Ural Soviet implemented a solution that the central leadership quietly wanted but preferred not to formally own. There's also a hybrid view, that the decision crystallized in a kind of feedback loop between Moscow and Ekaterinburg. Local leaders kept telegraphing that the military situation was deteriorating and that the risk of a rescue was escalating. Central leaders responded with deliberately vague authorizations that could later be disavowed if necessary. Under intense time pressure, with white detachments drawing closer by the day, the Ural Soviet read those ambiguities in the most radical possible way. What's clearer than the paper trail is the atmosphere in and around the Ipatiev House in early July 1918. The family could feel something shifting. Their walks in the garden were curtailed further. The guards' behaviour changed. Less conversation, more formality, an edge of tension that hadn't been there before. Newspapers, even the carefully filtered ones, stopped arriving regularly. Rumours about the White Advance seeped in through snatches of overheard conversations, half-finished sentences, a guard's muttered complaint. Inside the Bolshevik apparatus, the signals were much less subtle. The Czech Legion and White forces were closing in on the city from multiple directions. Ekaterinburg's status as a Red stronghold suddenly looked precarious rather than secure. Meetings at the Ural Soviet lengthened into the night. Yurovsky drew up new guard rosters, inspected weapons, rehearsed pretexts for moving the family within the house. Ammunition was checked. Vehicles were arranged, contingency plans drafted for what to do if the city fell. To the Romanovs, the Ipatiev House still presented itself as a place of waiting. Stifling, humiliating, but static. To the men holding the keys, it had become something else entirely. It was no longer just the house of special purpose. It was the house where, very soon, there would be no going back. On the evening of July 16th, 1918, the Ipatiev House tried to behave as if it were any other night. The family followed their usual cramped routine. They read, prayed, tried to keep up the habits of a vanished court in rooms that now smelled faintly of disinfectant and sweat. Outside, though, the city was tightening. Patrols increased. Orders moved along those narrow channels of Bolshevik communication. Sometime that night, the waiting ended. According to Yakov Yurovsky's later account, the final decision came late, after confirmation that white forces were near and that evacuation was considered impossible. Whether that confirmation was a real message from Moscow or a conclusion reached locally remains one of the key uncertainties. What we do know is that Yurovsky assembled a group of trusted guards and armed them. He checked pistols and revolvers, tried to sort out who was sober enough, reliable enough, ruthless enough for what was about to happen. The family, by contrast, went to bed still thinking in terms of train routes and possible transfers. They had been moved before, from Tsarskoye Selo to Tobolsk, from Tobolsk to Ekaterinburg. Another relocation, perhaps under worse conditions, would have seemed plausible. Death, in the middle of the night, in the cellar of a provincial merchant's house, probably did not. Just after midnight, in the first hours of July 17th, the summons came. Yurovsky had a pretext ready. He told the family they were being moved because of unrest in the city, or because of shelling, or because of some unspecified danger from the approaching whites. Different witnesses remember the wording differently, but the core story is consistent. They were ordered to get dressed quickly, gather their things, and come downstairs. The idea of an evacuation fit with what they already half expected. It was plausible enough to move them without open resistance. They brought cushions, a few personal items, even the small dog. The daughters wore their bodices stiff with sewn-in jewels, still thinking of those as emergency reserves for some future life. The Tsarevich Alexei, physically weak, had to be carried or helped. Guards later recalled the awkwardness of assisting the boy, knowing what they had been told was about to happen. The basement room they were herded into was not large. It had been prepared hastily, windows blocked, doors positioned to control entry and exit. The family were arranged along one wall, some seated, some standing. Again, accounts diverge in the details. In Yurovsky's version, he had them brought chairs for the sick boy and the Empress. In others, the configuration is slightly different. But the general picture is of a cramped space, crowded with people breathing heavily in the summer night. Then came the moment when the fiction of evacuation snapped. Yurovsky read out a brief statement. It said that the Ural Soviet had decided to execute Nicholas because of the threat from counter-revolutionary forces. In some reconstructions, the statement mentions the entire family. In others, the wording is fuzzier, or witnesses claim they didn't catch it clearly in the noise and confusion. There is disagreement even about whether Nicholas managed to respond. What? Or what, before the first shots were fired. This is where the scene often gets flattened into myth. A disciplined firing squad, a single volley, a quick, clean execution. The testimonies from participants suggest something much closer to chaos. The executioners were a mixed group. Chekists, Latvian riflemen, local Bolsheviks, many of them with little or no experience shooting people in an enclosed space. They were given different weapons: Nagant revolvers, Mauser pistols, Browning automatics. The room was small, stone or brick, with hard surfaces that bounced sound and lead in unpredictable ways. When Yurovsky gave the order to fire, the effect was immediate pandemonium. Multiple guns went off almost simultaneously. The confined basement filled with deafening noise, flashes of light and thick gun smoke. The first bullets ricocheted off walls and the concealed jewels in the daughter's clothing, flattening or glancing rather than penetrating. Some of the executioners, alarmed by the ricochets, started aiming lower. Others simply closed their eyes and fired. Witnesses later disagreed about who fell first, who screamed, who tried to cross themselves or reach for a loved one. Some remembered the Empress making a brief sound and collapsing. Others spoke of the daughter still standing, dazed after the first barrage. Several of the shooters claimed they had to step forward and fire at close range to finish off those who were still moving. There are stories of moans, of the dog being killed separately, of Yurovsky ordering everyone out so the room could be checked more methodically. What's striking in nearly every version is that it was not over in a single, precise moment. It took minutes. There were pauses, adjustments, additional shots. The room filled with smoke so dense that some of the executioners could barely see what they were aiming at. Bullets ricocheted and embedded themselves in brick and plaster. For all the revolutionary rhetoric about retribution and justice, the actual event was messy, improvised, visceral. When it finally stopped, the basement was hot and choking. The bodies lay tangled on the floor, some on top of others. Blood pooled and spread. Yurovsky did a quick, brutal inspection, ordering additional shots where he thought he saw movement. Even here, there is disagreement about just how thorough that check was, who exactly fired the final rounds and in what order. What is clear is that there was no ceremony, no words spoken over the dead. The urgency was all about logistics, because from the moment the last shot was fired, a new problem replaced the one they thought they had solved. They had to get the bodies out, clean the room, and lock the house back into its routine before dawn. Neighbours, even if relocated, might hear something. Guards on the outer perimeter might ask questions. The men inside the house began dragging, lifting, hauling. Bloodstains were covered as best they could be, later to be scrubbed and whitewashed. Personal items were collected, searched for valuables and bundled. Above ground, the fiction had to be maintained. Within hours, telegrams were on their way, not announcing a family massacre, but something much narrower and more politically digestible. The version sent out from Ekaterinburg and soon echoed in Soviet newspapers spoke of the execution of Nicholas alone. It framed the act as a necessary response to counter-revolutionary plots and the White Advance. The wording emphasized class justice and revolutionary necessity. Of the Empress, the children, and the remaining servants, the official announcements said nothing, or spoke only in vague terms about their being removed or evacuated. This asymmetry was deliberate. Killing the former Tsar could be justified as the overthrow of a symbol and a potential military asset. Admitting to the execution of his daughters and a sick 13-year-old son was something else entirely. So, in those first days, the public story was severely edited. Locals heard rumours, foreign diplomats picked up fragments, counter-revolutionary leaflets speculated wildly. But the Soviet line held. Nicholas had been shot. The rest of the family's fate was left in a fog of hints and omissions. Down in the cleaned basement of the Ipatiev House, the physical evidence of what had happened was already being erased. Outside, in communiques and newspaper columns, a different kind of erasure began. A carefully controlled narrative that would, for decades, obscure not only how they died, but what exactly had been done with their bodies once the cellar went silent. The men who had fired the shots now faced a problem their pistols couldn't solve. Killing the Romanovs in a locked basement was one thing. Making them vanish, in a city on edge, with enemy troops moving closer every day, was something else entirely. Yurovsky knew the clock was already running. White forces were advancing toward Ekaterinburg. Rumours raced ahead of them. If the city fell and any sign of the massacre remained, bullet-scarred walls, bloodstains, bodies buried in a shallow pit nearby, it wouldn't just be a local scandal. It would be an international catastrophe for the Bolsheviks. The order, as he later described it, was straightforward in principle. Remove the bodies under cover of darkness, transport them out of town, and conceal them so completely that even if the Whites did take the city, they would find no physical proof that the imperial family had been executed. In practice, almost nothing about that process was straightforward. First, there was the sheer physicality of the task. 11 bodies, several of them heavy adult men, had to be dragged out of a residential house, loaded onto wagons or trucks, and moved over rough roads at night. This wasn't a quiet, surgical operation. It was sweaty, noisy labour. Boots on floorboards, bodies thudding against doorframes, whispered arguments in the dark. They had to move fast but not attract attention. They had to be thorough, but work with whatever transport and manpower they could assemble on short notice. And they had to do it in a city threaded with sentries, informers, and ordinary people who might look out a window at the wrong moment. According to Yurovsky's later testimony, the plan was to take the bodies out along the Captivity road into the forested area north of the city where abandoned mine shafts and pits dotted the landscape. The region was already associated with executions and burials. It was remote enough to limit witnesses, but close enough to reach in a single night's work. This plan, at least on paper, had a cold internal logic. Dump the bodies in a deep shaft, collapse the sides, maybe toss in grenades or acid, and let water, time and geology finish the job. No graves to be stumbled upon, no markers, just another scar in an already scarred industrial landscape. But even the best paper plans run up against reality. The trucks or wagons they used were not modern, silent vehicles. They rattled. They struggled over soft ground. The roads themselves, especially after rain, could turn into rutted channels of mud. Horses balked, engines stalled, and every delay increased the risk that someone would see or hear something they shouldn't. Then there was the problem of the bodies themselves. They were not anonymous prisoners. They were the former emperor, his wife, their children, and loyal servants whose faces had appeared in newspapers around the world. If the Whites found intact remains that could be identified, even tentatively, the Bolsheviks' carefully crafted narrative would collapse. So the disposal had to be more than burial. It had to be an erasure. Different participants would later describe different methods: stripping the bodies, dousing them with acid, burning clothing, disfiguring faces, depositing them in a pit, then reconsidering and moving them again. Yurovsky's own account suggests that the initial burial site turned out to be less secure than he expected. Too shallow, too close to a road, too easy to find if someone came looking. Faced with that, he appears to have done something that would echo through the case for decades. He improvised. He reportedly decided on the spot to change the hiding place. That meant hauling already buried bodies out of one pit and moving them to another location in the same general area. It meant a second round of digging, exhaustion, and hasty decision-making in the pre-dawn hours. And it also meant that, in the fog of fatigue and fear, the once clear idea of a single, secret grave began to fracture. This is where logistics begin to turn into mystery. because when people later tried to reconstruct the route, the sequence of burial and reburial, and the exact number of bodies at each stage, they ran into a wall of contradictions. One man remembered a certain number of corpses being unloaded. Another insisted they had been separated at some point. Some claimed that clothes were burned on site, others that they were destroyed elsewhere. Yurovsky himself produced more than one written account, and they don't all line up in detail. It's tempting to treat these discrepancies as signs of deliberate deception, a planned cover story with built-in misdirection. That's possible. Bolshevik functionaries had political incentives to blur specifics, shift blame, or hide the full extent of what had been done. But there's another, less cinematic explanation that fits the evidence uncomfortably well. Improvisation under pressure. Imagine a small group of men, some drunk, some terrified of white retribution, trying to move 11 bodies along muddy forest roads in the dark. The first chosen pit floods or proves too shallow. A cartwheel sinks. A horse panics. Dawn is edging closer. Orders are reinterpreted. Shortcuts are taken. Not everything is recorded, remembered, or even consciously noticed at the time. Under those conditions, later testimony is almost guaranteed to be messy. People compress timelines. They misremember the order of events. They conflate one pit with another. They try to fit a chaotic night into a linear narrative that satisfies investigators, party officials, or their own need for coherence. And somewhere in that chain of rushed decisions and half-remembered actions, something else seems to have happened, something that would fuel decades of speculation. By the time investigators, both Soviet and later, tried to match the various accounts of that night and the next day, one pattern kept resurfacing. The sense that the bodies might not have all ended up in the same place, or even in the same condition. Yurovsky's mention of separating some remains, of extra measures taken with certain corpses, combined with conflicting recollections from subordinates, opened a crack in the narrative. Through that crack would eventually pour a flood of theories, about 2 bodies handled differently, about partial burnings, about a deliberate decision to scatter or conceal them separately. The missing bodies mystery, the question of why, when a grave was finally found, it did not seem to contain everyone who had gone down into the basement, does not begin in a laboratory in the 1990s. It begins here, in the dark woods outside Ekaterinburg, on a night when a hasty cover-up collided with bad roads, failing nerves, and decisions nobody would clearly write down. By dawn, the men involved believed they had buried the problem. In reality, they had only relocated it. The Ipatiev House basement was clean. The official telegrams were vague but triumphant. The physical evidence lay under earth and brush, waiting. But the stories about how it got there were already diverging. When the White Army finally pushed into Ekaterinburg in July 1918, they knew they were late. They had been advancing for weeks on rumours. The Tsar was in the city. The Tsar had been moved. The Tsar had been executed. The Tsar's family was alive, or dead, or somewhere in between. By the time their troops actually entered the streets, those rumours had already hardened into one grim expectation. Something irreversible had happened inside the Ipatiev House. What they didn't know was exactly what, and what, if anything, was left to find. The Bolsheviks had not abandoned Ekaterinburg in a panic. They had time to remove documents, to stage retreats, to blow up rail lines and bridges, and they had time to clean. When white officers reached the Ipatiev House and pushed through the gates, they did not find a charnel house. They found an emptied residence under guard, rooms stripped of obvious incriminating traces. Furniture moved, personal belongings gone or scattered, the basement whitewashed, but for all that, the place still felt wrong. In the lower rooms, men noticed small things. Patches of wall that looked newer than others, oddly scrubbed floors, a faint discoloration that might have been old water stains, or might have been something else. They noticed the windows that had been painted over, the sand piled in corners, the thickness of the air. Some were soldiers, some were former local officials, others were simply people who, within days, started calling themselves investigators. There was no neat crime scene tape, no central authority with a clear procedure. There was Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Sokolov, a legal investigator eventually appointed by the white government, but even he was moving inside a landscape already disturbed by curious officers, looters, and frightened locals. The search began not with clinical precision, but with questions shouted in corridors. Who had been here the night of July 16 to 17? What had they heard? What had they seen? At first all they had were fragments. One guard claimed to have heard shots in the middle of the night. Another insisted he had seen wagons leaving the yard, heavily loaded, heading toward the forest road. A neighbour swore there had been terrible noises from the house, then silence. Someone else said they had seen smoke, or smelled something chemical, or watched men burning items in the garden. The problem wasn't a lack of stories. It was the flood of them. Under a collapsing state, with newspapers hungry for scandal and monarchists desperate for martyrdom, every whisper became potential evidence. People embroidered details without realizing it. Some lied because they wanted to be important. Others told partial truths because they were terrified of Bolshevik reprisals if the Reds ever returned. Sokolov tried to impose order on the chaos. He examined the basement, scraped the walls, dug bullets out of plaster. He found spent cartridges from several different revolvers and pistols, some identifiable as nugget rounds used by Cheka execution squads. He collected bone fragments and small pieces of flesh embedded in cracks. Chemical analysis, primitive by modern standards, suggested traces of blood despite the whitewash. The basement, in other words, told a story that eyewitnesses only hinted at. Multiple shooters, close range, a slaughter in an enclosed space. But the bodies themselves were gone. So the investigation moved outward, away from the city, along the same direction Yurovsky's trucks had taken. Out toward the forest, the old mines, the mud-choked tracks of the Koptiaki road. Here too evidence surfaced, but in pieces. Local peasants mentioned unusual activity on the night after the shots. Trucks bogged down, men swearing, lanterns moving along the tree line. Someone had seen a fire near an abandoned pit. Someone else remembered the smell of burning cloth. Word of a filled-in shaft circulated in nearby villages. Following these leads, search parties began to poke around the area of the Four Brothers mine. They found scraps of clothing, buttons, a corset stay, a singed fragment of fabric that looked like it had once been part of a dress, a severed finger bone, traces of quicklime, possible residues of sulfuric acid. All of it pointed in the same direction. There had been bodies here. They had been stripped, mutilated, doused with chemicals, maybe partly burned. Something human had been done and then hurriedly undone. But again, no intact bodies, no lined-up skeletons that could be photographed and laid to rest in people's minds. Instead, investigators were confronted with a landscape of absence, empty pits that might have held corpses, tracks leading to nowhere, stories that ended with, and then they filled it in. From this, Sokolov began building what would become the foundational narrative for decades. The Tsar and his family had been murdered in the Ipatiev House basement, their bodies transported to the forest, disfigured and destroyed, then hidden in a mine shaft or nearby grave. He collected testimonies, sketched maps, photographed the site, and compiled a massive dossier that would later be published in exile. But notice what he did not have. He did not have 11 sets of remains he could lay out and count. He did not have a complete, continuous chain of physical evidence that tied every bullet in the basement to every scrap of clothing in the forest. He had a mosaic built out of witness statements under duress, partial forensic traces, and his own effort to impose coherence on a night of improvisation. His conclusions were powerful, and for many people, persuasive. They fixed in the public imagination key images: the basement execution, the forest grave, the acid, the burning, the mine shaft. They also enshrined an idea that would prove resilient, that the bodies had been so thoroughly destroyed or concealed that recovery was effectively impossible. That idea mattered. It allowed monarchist circles to insist on the crime's barbarity. Not only did they kill them, they tried to erase them, while also leaving just enough uncertainty for rumours of survival to flourish. If there were no bodies, there was no absolute physical counterweight to stories of an escape, a switch, a last-minute rescue. It also meant that when the political winds shifted again, and Soviet power reasserted itself over the region, there was no grave the new authorities were forced to acknowledge. No cemetery, no marked site, just a set of contested memories and a forest where searchers had once dug, then stopped. The Whites, for all their urgency, never managed a definitive recovery for a few simple, brutal reasons. They were operating in a war zone, with limited time before retreat. The Bolsheviks had had days to sanitize the house, and nights to scramble their burial plans. The forest itself was large, riddled with old industrial scars, any one of which could conceal a shallow grave. and the very improvisation that had led Yurovsky to move and possibly separate the bodies meant that there was no single obvious place to look, no single pit that contained everything. So the investigation ended not with closure, but with a kind of uneasy consensus. The imperial family was almost certainly dead. Their remains had almost certainly been abused and hidden. The exact whereabouts of those remains were unknown. Into that gap, the space between almost certainly and exactly, later generations would pour their own stories. Claimants, doubts, competing maps of the forest, arguments over who had died where, and whether two of the smallest victims had somehow met a different fate. The first investigators had done what they could with what they had. But they left behind a trail of clues that pointed in multiple directions at once. And as the Russian Civil War ground on, and the Whites lost ground, that unfinished work, those conflicting trails, were buried under something else: defeat, exile, and silence. Silence didn't just fall over the story, it fractured it. After the Whites retreated and their investigators scattered into exile, what they left behind was not a solved crime, but a narrative with jagged edges. A basement full of bullets and blood, a forest full of scraps and acid burns, and no row of bodies anyone could point to and say, "Here, all of them, this is the end." That gap was small in purely logical terms. Most people who'd seen Sokolov's material, or heard the testimonies, accepted that the imperial family had been killed. But human imagination doesn't live in logic. It lives in the spaces logic can't quite fill, and in those spaces other stories began to grow. Think about what it meant, in the 1920s and 30s, to be part of the Russian emigration. You had lost your country, your property, often your family. You lived in Paris boarding houses, Berlin back rooms, Harbin hotels, nursing a sense that history had broken off in the middle of a sentence. For many monarchists, the dynasty wasn't just a political institution, it was a kind of spine. If the Romanovs were truly gone, every one of them, then the spine was snapped. So when whispers began to circulate that maybe, just maybe, one of the children had escaped, they didn't land in neutral soil. They fell into a community primed to receive them. At first, the rumours were almost shy. Hints that a girl had been seen on a train. A wounded boy smuggled out under a false name. A peasant woman who claimed she had helped a Grand Duchess cross a river in the dark. The fact that Sokolov himself had not produced 11 undisputed corpses gave these stories something they badly needed. Room. You could say, yes, the Tsar and Tsarina were murdered, certainly. Most of the children too. But Sokolov never found all the remains. The Bolsheviks themselves were inconsistent. Isn't it possible? Into that, isn't it possible, stepped people who were not shy at all. By the late 1920s, imposters were emerging with increasing confidence. A young woman in Berlin who attempted suicide and then, under pressure, remembered she was Anastasia. Another claimant in France insisting she was Maria. A boy in Poland rumoured to be the rescued Tsarevich. With each new figure, the pattern repeated. First scepticism, then a strange, hungry curiosity. Most of these claimants had stories that, on close inspection, crumbled. Dates didn't match. Languages they should have spoken fluently were halting or absent. Physical details were wrong, but that wasn't the point for many of the people around them. People wanted to believe. Not necessarily because they were naive, but because belief served functions that cold forensic probability never could. If Anastasia lived, then the dynasty lived in some form. If Alexei had been smuggled out, then the line of succession wasn't truly broken. If even one child had escaped, then the Bolsheviks had failed to finish what they started. For exiled monarchists, that was an intoxicating idea. The international press understood this on an instinctive level. Newspapers in Paris, London and New York weren't interested in the fine print of Sokolov's evidentiary chain. They were interested in headlines. Lost Grand Duchess found in German asylum sells far better than complex forensic questions remain about execution site. So each claimant became a spectacle. Reporters described their eyes, their scars, their supposed memories of life at Tsarskoye Selo. Editors commissioned comparison photographs. Lawyers and relatives were drawn into court cases that dragged on for years, turning individual lives into serialized dramas. Meanwhile, back in the Soviet Union, the official story was anything but clear and consistent. Immediately after the execution, local Bolshevik authorities had announced the Tsar's death, but not the fate of the rest of the family. Early statements hinted that the Romanov women had been moved. Others suggested that the decision to execute anyone beyond Nicholas had been improvised, unauthorized, even regrettable. Central authorities in Moscow were not always eager to clarify. Sometimes they emphasized the necessity of the deed. Sometimes they downplayed the details. Sometimes they simply declined to talk about it at all. Over time, the line hardened into something closer to silence. Discussion of the execution became tightly controlled. Archives were sealed. Official histories mentioned the event briefly or not at all. When questions about bodies or graves arose, the answer was often a shrug or a formula. The enemies of the revolution were punished. The details were unimportant. But secrecy has a strange property. It doesn't kill stories. It preserves them. Every time Soviet officials refused to answer a question, that refusal could be read, outside the USSR, as confirmation that there was something to hide. Every discrepancy between early Bolshevik statements and later Soviet textbooks became another tiny crack in the facade of certainty. For émigré communities and sympathetic journalists, those cracks were opportunities. Maybe the Cheka had lied when they said all the children died. Maybe the early reports that only Nicholas had been shot were closer to the truth. Maybe a child had been taken hostage, moved, bargained over, lost in the bureaucratic chaos of the Civil War. And then there was the arithmetic that wouldn't go away. The original execution order referred to 11 people. The Tsar, the Tsarina, 5 children and 4 remaining loyal servants. Sokolov's reconstruction strongly suggested 11 victims, but no one could point to 11 bodies. No one could list them, one by one, with remains to match. Even those who accepted that everyone had been killed often found themselves stumbling over that number. 11 deaths, 0 confirmed graves, a handful of bone fragments and burned remnants. The math felt off. As the decades passed, this unease condensed into a specific, enduring formula. 2 bodies missing. It didn't really matter whether people meant 2 of the children or 1 child and 1 servant. What mattered was that 2 was small enough to imagine a rescue and large enough to feel like a pattern rather than a mere oversight. That small, persistent mismatch between bodies expected and bodies found became the spark that kept the legend alive. It kept claimants coming forward, decades after the fact. It kept journalists returning to the story every few years. It kept émigré circles debating, in smoky back rooms and church basements, whether the true heir was hidden somewhere in Europe or South America, waiting for a day that never came. The politics of uncertainty did not just shape how people remembered the Romanovs. It shaped what they were allowed to hope for and what they were unwilling to give up. And it meant that when the Earth finally did give up its secrets, when real remains finally surfaced in the Russian soil, they would not be stepping into a vacuum of ignorance. They would be stepping into a world primed to question them. For people outside the Soviet Union, the Romanovs were a ghost story. For some people inside it, they were a rumor attached to a very real patch of ground. From almost the moment the executions happened, there were whispers in the Urals about a place in the woods where they had been buried. Not a neat cemetery with crosses and stones, a stretch of rough track, a clearing, a hollow that people pointed at with their eyes more than their hands. Locals knew that, on the night of the killings, trucks had gone out along the Kopchaki road. Men had been seen, mud-spattered, exhausted, coming back from the forest. There were stories about strange smells of burning, about acid, about hurried work done in the dark. And in communities where nothing went to waste and every cart rattling by was noticed, this kind of unusual activity tended to leave an outline in people's memories. But knowing something under Soviet rule was not the same as investigating it. To take those rumours seriously, to go out and search, meant asking questions about an act the state either justified as revolutionary necessity or preferred not to mention at all. The Romanovs were not just a dead family. They were a symbol of the old order, of class enemies, of everything Soviet propaganda said had to be destroyed for the new world to be born. Poking around their supposed grave wasn't a neutral hobby. It could look like sympathy. It could look like counter-revolution. And, in Stalin's USSR, looking like the wrong thing could kill you. So the knowledge that filtered through Ekaterinburg and its surroundings took on a careful underground shape. A driver would tell his son, decades later, what the road had looked like that night, A forester would point once at a cluster of birch trees and then immediately change the subject. Someone working in local administration would say in a lowered voice, they were taken out that way, and then never repeat it. Every now and then someone tried to push further. In the 1930s, there are hints of unofficial searches, small groups who went into the forest on Sundays, ostensibly gathering mushrooms or fishing, but really scanning the soil for disturbed patches, for old pits, for any trace that matched the stories. After the Second World War, as the political climate shifted slightly and some topics loosened at the edges, there were more private attempts. A teacher's husband digging a test trench with a shovel. A local amateur historian comparing veterans' anecdotes with old maps. But all of this operated under a hard limit. You could not file a formal request saying, "I would like to investigate the fate of the former emperor and his children." You could not announce that you were searching for Romanov remains. You could not publish your findings in any official venue. The line between curiosity and political crime was thin and constantly moving, and the people who lived under it learned a habit that historians now find everywhere in the record: strategic silence. That silence didn't mean people knew nothing. It meant they left less on paper. Reports that might have said, explicitly, "This looks like a burial site," instead said, "Work was conducted in the area." Memoirs written in the thaw period after Stalin's death skirted around specifics. "I participated in an operation I cannot describe." Even officials who had been involved in the original disposal may have avoided writing down details, not because they feared monarchists, but because they feared their own superiors. In a system built on purges and retroactive guilt, having too much concrete knowledge about any sensitive operation was dangerous. This is where the difference between knowing where and proving what becomes crucial. By the mid-20th century, there were people who could walk you, roughly, to the place where a grave likely was. They could say, "Here, somewhere along this stretch." They could point to old map coordinates, combine them with recollections about a particular bend in the road or a line of telegraph poles. That's location in a lived, human sense. But scientific proof is something else entirely. To declare to the world that you have found the grave of a murdered royal family, you need more than stories. You need bones that can be confidently associated with specific individuals. You need artifacts with clear provenance. You need a chain of custody that can survive legal and political scrutiny. Under Soviet conditions, almost every link in that chain was compromised in advance. You couldn't bring in international forensic teams. You couldn't publicize your methods. You couldn't even be sure that, if you did find something, it wouldn't be quietly reburied or moved by security services anxious to avoid complications. The state that controlled the archives also controlled the shovels, and it had no interest in reopening an execution it regarded as both foundational and, in some quarters, still slightly embarrassing. Meanwhile, time itself was doing what time always does to crime scenes. The forest changed, trenches collapsed, filled in by rain and thaw. Bones, if they were near the surface, shifted with the freeze and thaw cycles, were scattered by animals, or were further damaged by roots and microorganisms. The wooden markers or ad hoc signs that might have existed in 1918 rotted away. Paths were diverted, new logging tracks cut. What had once been a raw, disturbed wound in the landscape began to look, to the casual eye, like any other patch of woods. Human time worked on the evidence too. Men who had driven the trucks supervised the burial or heard direct confessions from those who did begin to die, taking precise coordinates with them, those who remained aged into a period where memory itself becomes unreliable. Was it the third ravine or the fourth? 50 meters from the road or 100? Did that farmhouse stand there before the war, or was it built after? By the 1960s and 70s, the situation had become paradoxical. Never before in Russian history had so many people, sort of, known where a grave was, and yet been so unable to prove it in a way that would count. The rumours persisted, grew more detailed in some tellings, blurred in others, but they remained rumours, strong enough to guide determined private searchers, too weak to compel official acknowledgement. The Soviet Union had, in effect, created a grave that was half secret and half obvious, protected not by walls or chains, but by fear, bureaucracy and erosion. That uneasy equilibrium would hold for decades, and it meant that when, in the late 20th century, the ground near Ekaterinburg was finally opened in a serious systematic way, the excavation didn't start from nothing. It started from generations of whispers and from a landscape that had been slowly, relentlessly erasing its own clues. The thing about a secret that everyone half knows is that it only takes one political shift for it to stop being a secret at all. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union was not the same country that had shot a Tsar in a basement. It was tired, bureaucratic, and, crucially, less terrified of its own past. The terror of the 1930s was gone. Khrushchev's thaw had opened a small window, then Brezhnev's stagnation had half closed it again, but something lingered. The idea that you could, cautiously, re-examine history without being shot for it. That change didn't immediately send official teams into the woods with shovels, but it did something almost as important. It made it possible for an ordinary person to decide, I'm going to look, and not assume that this decision was suicidal. In the late 1970s, one of those people was a local engineer and amateur historian named Alexander Avdonin. He wasn't a prince or a foreign journalist. He was exactly the kind of careful, technically minded Soviet citizen who, a generation earlier, would have kept his head down. But he had heard the same rumours everyone else had, and he had something most people didn't: access to hints from the archives, fragments from older investigations, and a stubborn belief that the truth of 1918 shouldn't stay buried forever. Working quietly with a small circle, Avdonin began to match testimonies, old maps, and landscape features. The vague, somewhere along that road became a more precise target. A shallow depression near an old mine, a spot that older locals nodded toward and then fell silent about. In 1979, in an atmosphere still thick with risk but no longer instantly lethal, he and a few others dug. They found bones, not a perfectly preserved family, laid out in order, but a jumbled collection of human remains mixed with metal, buttons and fragments of cloth. Enough to suggest that this was no random village grave. Enough to make the stories about trucks and acid and hurried work in the dark feel suddenly, horribly concrete. And then the old reflexes kicked back in. The discovery was not announced to the world. There was no press conference, no formal report in a major journal. The Soviet state of 1979 was not prepared to host an open, international investigation into the murder of the last Romanov Tsar. The bones were reburied. The exact location was kept within a small circle. The find hovered in a strange limbo, known but not yet acknowledged. The real break came a decade later, when the ground shifted again. Not in the forest this time, but in Moscow. Under Gorbachev, glasnost and perestroika began to pry open parts of Soviet history that had been sealed for generations. Mass repressions, famine, political terror, these became subjects of public discussion, even public shame. The Romanovs in this new landscape were not simply class enemies. They were part of a broader, painful story about what revolutionary violence had cost Russia. Now the rumour in the woods and the quiet dig in 1979 could connect to something larger. In 1991, as the Soviet Union itself was teetering on the edge of collapse, official permission was finally granted to excavate the suspected burial site near Ekaterinburg in a serious way. This time there were archaeologists, forensic specialists, and crucially, an awareness that the eyes of the world would be watching. What they uncovered was grim but methodical. A mass grave with 9 sets of human remains. The skeletons showed signs consistent with the historical accounts. Bullet wounds, bayonet injuries, evidence of burning and acid. Alongside them were artifacts, pieces of clothing, footwear, and personal items that matched what the family and their remaining servants were known to have had with them. Initial assessments based on height, bone structure, and dental work quickly converged on a narrative that seemed almost too neat. Here, it appeared, were Nicholas II, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and 4 members of their household staff. For a country just starting to admit the darker parts of its past, the symbolism was enormous. Russia, or what remained of it, could now point to a physical grave and say, this happened, not in legend, in this soil. But even at that first triumphant moment, there was a problem that refused to be buried. The historical record said 11 people had gone into the basement in July 1918. The Tsar, the Empress, 4 daughters, the haemophiliac heir Alexei, the family doctor, the cook, the valet, and the maid. The grave held 9 bodies. 2 were missing. That gap was not a minor detail. It went straight to the heart of every rumour, every survivor story, every whispered claim that one of the girls, or the boy, had somehow escaped. If all 11 had been found, skeptics could argue about identification techniques or political manipulation, but the basic outline would be settled. 9 out of 11 left the door open just enough for hope, doubt, and conspiracy to walk in together. As word of the excavation spread, Western media descended. Headlines spoke of the lost Tsar found and the Romanovs' grave revealed. Documentaries were pitched before the bones were fully analysed. For many viewers, the question felt answered. The age-old mystery of what happened to the Romanovs collapsed into a single image. Skulls lined up on a forensic table, a cross planted over a newly sanctified site. Inside Russia and among specialists, the reaction was more complicated. Some historians and scientists looking at the context and early forensic work found the case compelling and leaned toward accepting that these were indeed the Romanovs. Others were wary. The Soviet state was dying. Its credibility was near zero. Any investigation carried out under its authority or in its immediate aftermath was going to be suspect by association. Were the right experts involved? Were all steps documented? Could political needs have shaped what was announced, and when? And then there was that stubborn arithmetic: 11 in the basement, 9 in the grave. The excavation had solved one kind of mystery, the where that locals had been circling for decades. But it immediately sharpened another set of questions. If these 9 were who many believed they were, where were the other 2? Had their bodies been moved separately, destroyed more completely, never brought to this site at all? Or, whispered in some circles, shouted in others, had someone survived? The remains had emerged. A new era of investigation, argument, and contested memory was beginning. When you strip away all the romance and tragedy, identifying bones is a very unromantic business. It starts with the basics, forensic anthropology. Before anyone talks about DNA, you measure skull shape, pelvis angle, the fusion of growth plates. These give you age and sex estimates. You look at overall build, limb proportions, old injuries, dental work. You ask, how tall was this person in life? How well nourished? Did they have access to a dentist or a peasant's diet and a lifetime of neglect? For the Ekaterinburg grave, those first passes were already suggestive. One male skeleton matched Nicholas's reported height and build, and carried orthopedic changes consistent with riding and middle age. A female, similar in life stature to the Empress, had extensive dental work of a type accessible only to the very rich in early 20th century Russia. Younger female skeletons fell into height ranges that fit the Grand Duchesses. The servants' remains looked like what you'd expect from working-class adults of the period. On its own, that doesn't prove identity. It just sets the stage. These people look like the kind of people who could be the Romanovs. To go further, you need something more intimate than bone measurements. That's where DNA comes in. In living people, DNA identification is straightforward in principle. You compare a sample from an unknown person to either themselves at a different time, a very close relative, or a well-documented database. The closer the relationship, the stronger the match. For historical remains, it's trickier. No one took cheek swabs of Nicholas II in 1917, so forensic geneticists look sideways and backward into family lines. 2 types of DNA are especially useful. Mitochondrial DNA is passed almost unchanged from mothers to their children, generation after generation. Y chromosome DNA follows the direct male line. Both act like family signatures. In the 1990s, scientists compared mitochondrial DNA from the Ekaterinburg bones to samples from known living relatives of the Tsarina and the Tsar, including Prince Philip, whose maternal line linked back to Alexandra. The sequences lined up. The woman thought to be Alexandra shared a maternal haplotype with her modern relative. The man identified as Nicholas shared his maternal signature with his own extended line, and the supposed children in the grave carried combinations you'd expect from that couple. To many geneticists, this was powerful evidence. Multiple individuals in the grave formed a biologically coherent family unit, and that unit plugged neatly into the documented Romanov family tree through independently sourced relatives. Later analyses, using more sophisticated techniques and nuclear DNA, the stuff you inherit from both parents, reinforced the picture. The people in that grave looked, on the molecular level, like Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 daughters, and 4 unrelated adults. So why does anyone doubt it? Partly because of where and when the work was done. The first tests happened as the Soviet Union was dissolving, and the post-Soviet state was trying to reframe its relationship with the imperial past. For critics, that timing is suspicious. They ask whether samples could have been mixed, switched, or selectively reported to serve a political narrative of closure and reconciliation. There are also more technical worries. Ancient DNA is fragile. It degrades with time, heat, and moisture. To get a readable sequence, you often have to amplify what little is left, copying it many times over. That process is vulnerable to contamination, from modern handlers, from other remains, from the laboratory environment itself. Once contamination enters the chain, it can be hard to completely rule out its influence. Popular culture doesn't help. We talk about DNA like it's a magic yes or no button, match or no match, 100% certainty or total doubt. Real forensic work lives in the space between. A match is not a mystical revelation. It's a statistical statement. It says something like, given the way these DNA markers occur in human populations, the chance that this profile belongs to someone unrelated to the Romanovs is extremely small. How small is extremely? That depends on the data, the markers used, and the assumptions built into the analysis. And that's another fault line. Some skeptics don't necessarily deny that the bones are all related. They question how rare those specific DNA patterns really are, whether the comparison samples represent the broader population well, or whether key reference samples, like those taken from royal relatives, are as secure and unimpeachable as they are assumed to be. Then there's the matter of standards. In a modern criminal trial, DNA evidence is evaluated under strict protocols, documented chains of custody, independent labs, disclosure of methods and error rates, and the possibility of adversarial challenge. Even then, courts talk in terms of beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond all doubt. Jurors are reminded that absolute certainty is not the bar. Historical identifications operate under looser conditions. The bones have already been moved or hidden for decades. The original crime scene is gone. Witnesses are long dead. Politics and religion hover over every decision. Instead of building a case for a jury, scientists are trying to reconstruct a plausible story from partial, damaged, and sometimes compromised evidence. When experts say, these remains are identified as the Romanovs, they're making a judgment that weaves together anthropology, genetics, documented history, and probability. In the Romanov case, many leading specialists look at the converging lines of evidence, the physical fit, the family DNA, the artifacts, the matching wounds, and conclude that the identification is very strong. Others look at the same puzzle and see gaps: early Soviet involvement, missing documents, the potential for contamination, the pressure to finally put the mystery to rest. For them, strong is not the same as settled forever, and hovering over all of this is that unfinished equation from the grave itself: 9 bodies, 11 people in the basement. Because even if you accept that those 9 have been identified as the imperial family and their loyal servants, the DNA doesn't touch the question that has fueled books, films, and rumours for a century. Where are the other 2? When investigators first examined the Ekaterinburg grave in the late 1970s, and again in the 1990s, they could count 9 sets of remains: Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 daughters, and 4 members of the household staff. But they could also read. They had the execution orders, the guard testimonies, the post-July 1918 reports. They knew who was supposed to be in that basement: 11 people. The Tsar, the Empress, 4 daughters, the heir Alexei, the doctor, the cook, the maid, the valet. 9 bodies, 11 victims. Something didn't add up. From the beginning, that numerical gap shaped everything that followed. If the grave was genuine, it was incomplete. If it was incomplete, then somewhere out there, somewhere in the forests and mud and mining pits around Ekaterinburg, there had to be another burial, or a burning site, or a place where bodies had been destroyed so thoroughly that almost nothing remained. And if no such place could be found, for some people that was all the space they needed to keep hope alive. Maybe a daughter had been spared. Maybe the boy had been smuggled out. Maybe the missing 2 weren't missing at all. They were living under other names in other countries, telling stories that sounded wild, but suddenly, in light of those 9 skeletons, not quite impossible. For decades, this wasn't just a forensic puzzle. It was the fuel that powered imposters' claims, conspiracy theories, and genuine aching uncertainty inside families who desperately did not want to believe that every last Romanov had died in that room. Behind the myths, though, there were also very practical questions. Who was missing? The first analyses suggested the grave contained Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of the 4 Grand Duchesses, and the 4 adults. That meant 2 individuals were unaccounted for, 1 daughter and the Tsarevich Alexei. Which daughter, exactly, was initially unclear. Height estimates, age ranges, and skull damage left room for argument. That ambiguity was like oxygen for legend. If you couldn't even agree on which girl was gone, maybe you couldn't be sure any of them really were. The search for the second burial went nowhere for years. The original Soviet investigators had left conflicting reports about what they'd done with the bodies. Some hinted that they'd burned or buried 2 corpses separately. Others were vague, evasive, or clearly edited after the fact. When later researchers tried to reconstruct the route from the Ipatiev House to the forest, they ran into a tangle of half-truths and missing pages. Then the clock kept ticking. 60 years, 70. The forest changed. Roads were built, then rerouted. Locals remembered rumours, not coordinates. Files sat in secret archives. Political priorities shifted. And then, finally, almost 90 years after the murders, the landscape gave up something. In 2007, amateur searchers near the original burial site found a second, much smaller concentration of human remains. Fragments of bone and teeth, badly damaged and partially burned. It was not the neat line of skeletons seen in the first grave. It was a scatter, as if bodies had been mutilated, set on fire and only partially buried. The discovery could have been anything. Soldiers from the Civil War, victims of some later atrocity, even animal remains misidentified in the field. But the context raised eyebrows. The site lay close to the known grave, along the same rough route described in some of the earliest Bolshevik accounts of the disposal. The bones looked young. Some were small enough to be adolescent or early teen. Forensic work began again. Anthropologists examined the fragments and concluded that they represented a boy in his early teens and a girl in her mid to late teens. The age estimates lined up disturbingly well with Alexei and the youngest Grand Duchesses at the time of their deaths. But this time the scientists were not working with mostly intact skeletons. They had pieces, burned, broken, environmentally battered for nearly 9 decades. Traditional measurements could only go so far, so they went back to DNA. By 2007, genetic technology had leapt ahead of what was available in the early 1990s. Techniques for extracting and amplifying tiny degraded samples had improved. Contamination controls were better. New markers could be analysed. And crucially, researchers now had a confirmed genetic profile from the first grave, the Romanov family unit identified earlier, to compare against. Multiple labs, in Russia and abroad, tested the second site remains. Independently, they reported the same pattern. The boy's DNA matched what you'd expect from a son of Nicholas and Alexandra. The girls matched what you'd expect from their daughter and fit genetically as a sibling to the daughters already identified in the main grave. On paper, the puzzle finally seemed solved. 2 graves, 11 victims, 1 tightly packed burial for 9, 1 chaotic, partially burned deposit for the missing heir and 1 sister. The ages fit. The genetics fit. Some historical accounts of how the killers panicked, tried to destroy 2 of the bodies with acid and fire, and buried them separately suddenly looked less like clumsy cover stories and more like clumsy but broadly accurate confessions. And yet even here certainty refused to be absolute. Skeptics pointed out that the second site's chain of custody was even messier than the first. The bones were found by non-professionals in a politically charged moment, then turned over to authorities. Could something have been planted, swapped, mishandled? The remains were fragmentary enough that questions about exactly how many individuals were present and how they'd been treated could be argued. There were debates over which daughter the missing girl actually was. Some anthropological assessments said Maria, others Anastasia. DNA can tell you she's their daughter, but it can't tell you which sister if all the sisters share the same parents. The identification rested on stature estimates and contextual clues, and not everyone agreed. Behind the forensic arguments sat something larger. By the late 2000s, access to Russian archives had opened up in ways unthinkable in the Soviet era. New documents about the execution and early investigations surfaced. Some reinforced the emerging 2-grave narrative, others muddied it with contradictions. Church commissions, state committees, and independent experts sometimes reached different conclusions about how to interpret the same files. Technology had advanced. Evidentiary standards had tightened. But politics and belief had not vanished. For some, the second grave closed the last real loophole. The Romanov story, however tragic, was now complete. Every person in that basement could be linked to a set of bones in the ground. For others, the very neatness of the solution made them uneasy. Two sites discovered decades apart, in a country eager to reconcile imperial martyrs with a revolutionary past, tied together by tests and testimonies that always seemed to emerge just when a new wave of doubt was cresting. In that tension between evidence that converges and narratives that compete, the Romanovs' missing two didn't so much vanish as change roles. They stopped being potential survivors and became something else, the focal point for questions about trust, procedure, and who gets to say when a mystery is over. Stand back from the bones, the basements, the lab reports, and something bigger comes into focus. The Romanov case isn't just a whodunit with a royal family at the centre, it's a mirror held up to what revolutions do, to people, to truth, to memory. From the moment Nicholas and his family were shot, secrecy wrapped itself around the story. The killers lied to their own side. The Bolshevik leadership lied to the public. Reports were edited and re-edited, graves were concealed, files were locked away. Even when the Soviet state finally admitted in the late 1980s that the Tsar had been executed, the narrative was carefully managed, sanitized, partial. That's not unique. Revolutions everywhere run on a strange fuel mix of idealism and paranoia. They promise a new, honest world, then immediately start classifying, redacting, and burying anything that might weaken their claim to moral necessity. The Romanov executions were supposed to be a clean break with the old order. Instead, they became a crime too awkward to fully own and too dangerous to fully explain. The result is trauma that never quite finds a resting place. For the imperial family's relatives in exile, the lack of bodies and clear documentation meant they were trapped in a kind of emotional limbo for decades. They had to mourn, but also answer letters from strangers insisting that a cousin was alive in Brazil, or that Anastasia was living quietly in a provincial town. Every new rumour opened the wound again, but the trauma isn't all on one side. Think about the guards in the Ipatiev House. Young, radicalised, often poor. Some believed in what they were doing, others drank themselves numb. A few later talked, then recanted, then changed details again as regimes shifted and interrogators changed. Their testimonies are stained with fear. Fear of punishment for saying too much. Fear of being blamed for decisions taken higher up. Fear of their own memories. The locals around Ekaterinburg carried another layer of it. Farmers who stumbled on bones. Miners who heard whispers about special pits. Priests who conducted clandestine prayers. For most of the Soviet period, everyone knew you were safe for not asking questions. So the questions went underground, into family stories and half-remembered gossip. Then come the investigators. White officers in 1918, Soviet commissions in the 1920s, amateur searchers in the 1970s, forensic teams in the 1990s and 2000s. Each generation approaches the same patches of forest and the same decaying documents, but with different tools, different agendas, different red lines. Each leaves its own fingerprints on the case. None can start from zero. When you combine that human tangle with partial documentation and intense politics, you get the perfect conditions for myth. Gaps in the record are like vacuum. They don't stay empty. People fill them with hope, with fear, with stories that make the chaos feel less random. In an empire collapsing into civil war, it was easier for some to believe that an innocent child had been spared than to accept that every last avenue to the old world had been cut. In a Soviet Union trying to justify its founding violence, it was easier to pretend the whole affair had been tidy and necessary than to admit to panic, botched burials, and acid-scarred corpses. Once myths like that take root, they are hard to dislodge, even when evidence improves. Anna Anderson could be exposed by DNA and still retain a residual aura in popular culture. New remains can be tested and matched, and yet polls in Russia still show people who suspect some Romanovs survived, or that the bones were switched, or that the whole thing is a fabrication designed to serve whoever's in power now. So what can we actually say with confidence? We can say that the family was killed in Ekaterinburg in July 1918. We can say the 9 bodies found in the first grave and the 2 from the second site form a genetically coherent group matching the known Romanov family. We can say multiple independent labs and investigators in different countries and political contexts have arrived at broadly convergent conclusions. We can also say that some details will probably always remain interpretive. Exactly who gave which order and when. Precisely how each body was treated in those chaotic hours on the road. Which daughter lies where. Whether specific memoirs are honest recollections or memories reshaped by fear, guilt, and time. Those questions sit in the realm where forensic traces run out, and historians have to weigh probabilities, motives, and patterns of behaviour. And that's where this mystery still matters most. It forces us to confront how we decide a story is over. Do we defer to state commissions, to church councils, to foreign labs, to our own emotional needs? The Romanov case shows what happens when those answers don't line up, when scientific closure collides with political narratives and personal grief. It also asks a quieter question. What do we owe the dead in times of upheaval? Is it enough to find their bones and put names to them? Or do we also have to examine the systems, the ideologies, and the ordinary people who made those deaths possible, and then kept them in the dark for generations? In the end, the missing two aren't just about a prince and a princess in a forest. They're about how a society remembers its breaking point, how it stitches together a past built on secrecy, and how each of us decides which version of events we're willing to live with. And as we'll see in the final part of this story, the way Russia, and the world, has tried to answer those questions around the Romanovs tells us as much about our present as it does about that basement in 1918. So, we end where we began. A basement. A burst of gunfire in the dark. 11 people dead. Then the bodies hauled into the forest, doused with acid, buried, moved, hidden. After that, decades of silence and rumour. Priests whispering prayers, old men in kitchens insisting they'd seen Anastasia, archivists turning keys in doors that weren't supposed to open. And finally, shallow graves, broken bones, lab coats, DNA sequences on computer screens. The broad outline now is hard to escape. The execution happened, the concealment happened, the families on all sides lived with the fallout, and the bones that surfaced in the late 20th century almost certainly belonged to the people who went down into that basement. But inside that outline, the details are still a minefield. Which testimony is reliable? Which memory is warped? Which fragment of bone belongs to which girl? In a story this charged, every careless, definitely, every lazy, proves once and for all, pushes us a little further from honesty. So if you've stayed with this all the way through and you'd like more stories that move slowly and carefully through the past, it genuinely helps if you like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Are you in a dark room past midnight or on a bus in the middle of the afternoon? If you're curious about that earlier bottleneck in our species' story, the prehistoric near extinction that reshaped human evolution, I've written a whole book about those buried secrets and the strange, fragile line that leads from a few thousand survivors to us. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. Because the Romanovs are one chapter in a much longer pattern, small groups of humans pushed to the edge, caught in storms they didn't choose, leaving behind bones and questions. In the next story, we're going to step even further back from palaces and firing squads, and look at how close our entire species came to disappearing, and what survived when almost everything else was lost.